home studio. I'm excited about being here for Beard Banter episode 46. I hope there are a lot of you that are going to be in the chat and giving me your opinions and thoughts and what you believe about this subject. And before I bring on my guest, I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of Jason Slagle. Yesterday, Jason made a post for his auth 66, and I think it was just perfectly timely. So I'm going to bring him on virtually. He doesn't even know it. It's perfect. Thank you, LinkedIn. The magic of LinkedIn. So let's go.
About I'm a huge proponent of
And
open
he is
source
not
software.
Matt Lee, by the
Because
way,
it's an
even though it
open
says
source.
so
I've
on
been a
the
Linux
corner.
guy
It's
since
Jason
before
Slagle.
Windows 95 came out. Slackware 3, I think it was. Kernel 1. No, kernel 0.99 point something the first time, and then I was on 1.2.13, which was forever, right? But there is a cost that comes with it, right? And so we are dealing with a customer. I actually pushed them off, so we're not dealing with them now. But we have a customer that's not a regular. They're not a managed customer. They're just a customer that comes in for occasional consulting work around things like TrueNAS. And this customer has embraced a ton of open source projects, right? They're using like all of the open source, like Service Desk, VPN, right? Like all of the things they've got installed, and they got compromised. And so I am again a huge fan of open source, but it does come with the requirements that you keep it up to date and maintained it. I mean, that's not unique to open source software, but it seems to be the case that in many instances, these companies install these open source alternatives to commercial software, and then they just, once they're working, they just don't touch them again. They let them go. They never update them. They never look to see if there are updates. They don't, in many cases, firewall them off, and eventually it comes back and bites them. So yes, open source good, unpatched open source bad.
All right. So you heard it here first, folks. Open source good, unpatched open source bad, as Jason said. Idan, it's great to have you here. I wanted to kick us off with Jason's wise words. I saw him yesterday and I was like, he's reading my diary again. I'm talking about this tomorrow, like all day tomorrow. So, Jason, if you're here, bro, you were here virtually and in my heart. But if you are here, chime in the chat and kind of tell me your thoughts and maybe even jump in if you want to. But Idan, introduce yourself, brother. What are we here to talk about? And tell me who you
Yeah,
are.
I'm happy to be here. Thank you. Idan, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Illustria. We look for blind spots or misconfiguration in open source components. So, you know, this is exactly what we're talking about.
Right in your wheelhouse.
Exactly,
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, exactly what he said. We're deeply concerned about the problem of open source. I'd love to dig in and talk about how we feel about it.
Yeah, we will. And I want to say thank you to Shai Cohen at Kumanja for actually connecting the two of us. I kind of broached the topic to him and said, hey, I want to talk about this. And he's like, I've got the guy, right? He said, I know who you need to talk to. So thanks for being
Yeah.
here. Let's start by what I'd love to have you do is let's try to come up with bullet lists of where we see major failures. We'll start talking on, first off, like Jason's point. And Jason's really talking about free and open source software, right? Compiled software that's being used. But he's also alluding to, I have to imagine, code that's being used as part of some other project and things where you more focused. But let's start with his. How do you see people fail and how do you see people succeed at staying up to date with modern changes in these architectures and in code and in these applications for
Yeah.
open source?
So 90% of the code in our apps comes from open source, and this is great. I feel open source world is amazing because it started from developers trying to help other developers. Today developers don't write the code from scratch. They use open source libraries like a Netflix catalog that you just take it, download, do some manipulation about it, and you have a working app. This is amazing. I think the problem here is the trust. You don't know, the origins. You don't know who are the maintainers, and
Yeah.
from the other side, developers are not security experts, and I don't blame them because they're very stressed to finalize the sprint on time. So you have a situation that some maintainers who believe in open source and they did it maybe like 10 hours a month, a week. They do it because they believe in the vision of open source. They fixing bugs, release notes. But again, they can do a lot of mistakes that can someone, hijack, compromise, whatever.
Yeah.
And
So make sure I understand you first, at least in this first point on up to date. You already have this gap forming of in each, let's say, open source product I consume, whether it be something that's compiled and I'm using it on my desktop, or whether it be something as a piece of code that's being borrowed to make life easier for programming or for that next step. Each of them can have varying people of origin that have created it, from whether they be good personas or bad personas, potentially even. But then in addition to it, once you do, let's say, find some good persona product that has existed, there's even gaps between those that are fully supported. People are putting 10 hours a week, to your point, into coding and recoding and putting in release notes and finding broken pieces and things like that, and patching bugs and vulnerabilities, presumably, right in that space. But then you have the inverse of that, where there is nobody caring about that. There hasn't been an update to this code in a very long time. And so those are two separate problems, right? Once we've even defined, is it a nefarious backed or entity or not? And I think one of the things that stood out that you just said to me is there are people that create code for bad or for good, but either way, we're not looking that up when we're developers. We're not going and saying, ooh, should I use this code? It's someone's done this before and it looks good. You don't know who has the keys to that code. You don't know who has the keys to change that code and to make a difference in it from a supply chain perspective. You haven't done any due diligence or due care on that creator. I mean, you do some work. Like, I know developers have told me they go and do, well, how many people have forked this and how many people have updated this and how many pulls are there on it and those kind of things, right? That at least sets, it's got a lot of people. But yeah, anyways, a lot to unpack there. So anything spark interest in that point in your conversation?
Exactly. I mean, this is exactly the issue here for like who is the maintainer? What is the identity behind him? Let's assume he's a real person and he's on the good side. So he maintains its packets and you know what will happen after 20 years? You know, he said, okay, I don't want to do it anymore. Maybe I have kids. Maybe I don't have time to do it. What's going on right now? I mean, I saw some published about it. He's like, oh, I want someone to take it out of my hands. And what is their due diligence?
Dude, that's bullet point number 2, Idan. That's number 2, because you're getting into, when I, as an entity, as a company, MattLee dies, company continues, at least in most C Corp, S Corps, right? There's a company entity there, right? Whatever it may be. And that has financial interest in continuing said product as long as it's financially valuable. And so you have always an interest in that product. But if, to your point, if I've made something and it's cool and it was a cool project and lots of people followed it, then I decide, like this whole kid thing, it's cool pushing my daughter on a swing, comes into value, there might be a drop in the interest of that non-commercial product and maybe no maintenance following that. So that's, I think, bullet number 2 is, let alone can I update it? Can I stay with it? Which I don't know if we fully hit. But bullet point 2 is definitely like, that person could change their interest in that, is your point. So continue. Sorry, I just wanted to highlight that.
So think about it as a Wild West. Everybody, do whatever they want. No regulation whatsoever. Trust issue. And you know what? It's good for organizations because they run faster. They don't need to code it from scratch. But I feel like it's already sometimes too late because you're already using this script of code, and now if lots of updating are happening. And you know, there is a famous on the Russian-Ukraine war about some maintainer who maintained an open source library for 8 years. He's an amazing guy. I know him. He has 2 million weekly downloads. It's amazing. But he added a new functionality from a Ukraine-Russian war that if your IP is from Russia or Belarus, your whole open source deal would delete. And this is maybe bullet number 3. You know, he said, I'm this is my code. I'm maintaining this code. This is your problem when you use that. So now we have political also issues in stuff. So the question is now, should we use his code? I don't know. I mean,
and I also don't know, in my opinion, and I don't like to tackle political or geopolitical or religious topics personally, just not my best interest. But I would say, you know, what's interesting about that is you probably have the same behavior for commercial use code too. They still find themselves along company lines, along country lines, along political lines, along things in that same nature. So I wouldn't make that a free and open source only challenge. I would say you definitely have more granular one-to-one, the person decides it, now I'm going to do it, control, comparative to a large commercial interest software. That's a big difference. But anyways, the reason this comes to mind is you saw I think it was Lookout Security was giving a talk about modern cell and modern mobile attacks and things like that. And what was interesting was one of the things they showed was a commercial software vendor had an embedded actual weaponized malware to attack like the other major vendors they were competing against, but also to spy on the user, to make it impossible to uninstall their app, like all kinds of stuff. And anyway, so you see that kind of behavior play out in a lot of different ways, not specific to free and open source, but back to the point of open source software. I think the third bullet point that you and I were talking about before is really like, how do you know and track that even if it wasn't nefarious or well hidden, but someone just makes a mistake, someone makes a mistake in a downstream application that I'm keeping up to date? How do I validate that code is good? Now, a lot of that's where your focus is, right? Is actually just, we don't care where it came from or how it was maintained. We only want to surface kind of what is the challenge, like what's bad with this code. Is that a approach you're taking, or help me understand?
Exactly. It's a bit like someone knocks at your door at 4 a.m. and you shouldn't open it. This is in general how we look at that. I mean, if we see a library that maintain on a weekly basis, this specific maintainer is a good guy, and then we see 70 commits in 1 minute, something happened there, and then we realize that someone hijacked his account because lack of MFA. So if something smells bad, we can understand what's going on, or try to understand. So
interesting. So you're not just approaching misconfigurations, you're trying to approach some of it from a heuristics perspective too, like what you're seeing happen in the code base being delineable from somebody else. How do you take that and make it an advantage, right? Because you could interrupt production, you could interrupt maybe a series of rapid changes that are trying to fix a bug. Like how do you how do you delineate?
We try to catch it before it comes to production. So the best way to catch it is on the installment itself, when you do the pip install, npm install on the developer workstation or on the CI/CD. But think about those as operational risks that may be malicious in the future. So it's not a point of CVE, let's patch it, amazing. It's about maliciousness, or future malicious can be, in the future, because we see something change within the behavior of this package. And lots of false positive, we try to don't lower that as well, but those gray areas are very interesting because usually there is a story behind every package.
So if I understand you correctly, the first thing to do is to not let them get the package in the beginning if it's already inherently malicious. That's one of the first steps in trying to approach this. And we have shifted very much into programming. So if anybody has a question they want to ask in chat, like that takes us on a different tangent, please feel free to. I see a few of you there. So please feel free to chat. We'll post it up here and go a different way. But so we get into stopping them from getting the package when they go to pull that package down to use it and consume it in the very first fashion, and saying, nope, this one's not allowed, not okay. So that's one approach to it, is blocking it.
I mean, it's so go ahead.
No. And the second piece would be, once I've approved something that is good, I now have this responsibility to track that. And that gets into some of the whole challenges of, like, not just a software bill of materials, right, or SBOM, which says here's the free and open source software I am using, right, but also into like the change inside that material set and how it's functioning, and trying to watch that delta. So did I understand you correctly? That's two vectors you would try to approach. The first one being, don't let you get it if I know it's bad. And second, so that's kind of more like that blacklisting kind of model. And then the second one would be don't let you, or fix it if it starts to stop its use, if it starts to be a problem.
It's correct. It's very intrusive to stop a library in the beginning. We don't want to interfere also in the daily job of developers. So it's more about managing the risks. Sometimes we will stop it, but something very malicious. And we also scan repositories to think about, let's say, a library that wasn't maintained for a lot of time, or something changed, or for example, the domain expired. So think about a library, you use it as an open source library for weeks, for months. It's amazing. You have amazing maintainer. He believes in open source, but he forgot to pay on his private domain, and it's got expired. So basically, we can buy the domain.
Oh yeah, I could buy the domain, reset the password.
I mean, right? So this is another case that we have like a raising flag. Okay, the domain is expired, scoring changed. Now let's do remediation. Let's see if something happened with this library. Maybe we shouldn't do it right now, but let's manage the risk.
Yeah. So it's not just making immediate stop in your case, in your approach. It's also about surfacing the data so you can make decisions on it.
Exactly.
And I guess I get that, right? You're focused when we talk about supply chain risk. Maybe
Yeah.
we're being way too deep in the
Yeah.
weeds here. What is supply chain risk? Let's explain that first. Start there. What's a supply chain
Exactly
risk?
what-
I know this sounds stupid, but what is it?
It's exactly what we talk about right now. I mean, my company is not matter what we're doing. It's about managing how the process. Think about open source. Think about the code like a factory. And if you have a factory, you have some processes that happening simultaneously, but eventually you have let's say the base of code, and in the end you have the application. What's happening in
Right.
supply chain is like, you can refer to Amazon, whatever, FedEx. You're getting a lot of codes from different places without any regulation whatsoever. You don't know the region, you don't know who is the person behind it. And eventually this is like, I don't know who created this phrase supply chain. I need to find that guy, but this is how we manage the code itself, like supply chain process.
Yeah.
Um,
And I'll take a stab at it myself, right? So, in my mind, at a more broad definition, what is supply chain risk? If I buy eggs from you and they are spoiled and I eat them and I am poisoned and I could have bought them from a farmer that had done things the right way, I would not have been poisoned by said eggs, right? And so supply chain risk is that inherent risk when I do business with someone that they don't uphold their end of the bargain, that they aren't meeting their side of securing themselves, protecting themselves, or delivering their products, whatever that may be. And there's broader definitions of supply chain risk. But in my security definition, we're focusing on partners and partners of partners and components of those partners' delivery. When you really think about it, it doesn't just stop at the first level, it's the next level and the next
Exactly.
level, and maybe even the deeper granularity. And one of those granularities being when I use code and that person has made that code in the factory you describe, what components did they get put into their code? Like which milk supplier did they buy from? Which, right? I guess I don't know. I must be hungry because I'm only going into food type products in factory. I didn't get it all into anything that's more fun there. But genuinely, so we all now kind of at least have an understanding. Supply chain risk is the risk of others on us and the things they do. One of those focuses is on the use of tons of software that we aren't even aware of. And we've seen this play out, right? Look at things like Log4j. How long did it take for people to say, yes, I actually had this as a vulnerability inside my platform and the product I used? Or when you get into PwnKit and the PoleKit vulnerabilities, that was a little easier to diagnose. Now you get into, there was a recent one that was extremely hard to diagnose because it was built into the libraries of image viewers in web rendering. I can't remember what that one was, but it was just a recent one. And so you get into these challenges of like people don't even know what they're subject to and what they're vulnerable to, let alone what the software they use and how it uses things down the chain. They're very ignorant to a lot of where this code comes from and how its supply chain is created, how the factory handles the food product and keeps it safe and all of those things. And so I think that's the challenge of what I wanted to define here. Is that a better or at least a decent stab at supply chain risk and some of its facets, I suppose?
It's much better than how I said it. So yeah, and I can refer the let's say the partners to dependencies, which are basically libraries dependent to each other. And this is interesting for my tech when you say about eggs or rotten eggs or whatever. I feel like we identified that the eggs are rotten only after we ate them. And that's the problem.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. Yeah, that's the real problem. I don't mind figuring it out when I got the rotten egg and I break one open and go, oh, that's horrible. I'm going to stop baking this cake right now. It's really once we eat that cake that's the problem.
And then you have stomach problems and you say, okay, I have a problem. And that's when we understand we have a problem in supply chain. So this is great.
In this specific vein of it, and really even truly in the greater vein of it. Think about the use of SolarWinds or Kaseya in each of those iterations and what that meant to the end consumer as that went on. And that would be stuff that's very supply chain oriented and very tied in. In the way I handled Secret 123, let's say, having a direct impact into how my software gets made and gets injected with an actual payload. Or something that gives that kind of capability. So those are the things where, supply chain is something that's under focused on, I think, in my opinion. I don't think there's a whole lot of infrastructure of us doing that kind of validation, especially when you look at all that's required between a company to get rid of the 600 question security vulnerability questionnaire is having a SOC 2. That doesn't even come close to addressing some of those things and certainly doesn't get into the code level architecture of how your operation functions and makes code, right? Like that's got to be a gap right now is the oversight and regulation and even governance in in code
So
development, right?
this is excellent subject. First of all, think about an open source libraries. I see them as like a bubbling, waiting to explode inside the organization, like a silent silos. This is how I see it. I'm deeply concerned. Okay, and this is the problem. Now we talk about government. You have Executive Order 14028 that now through Biden initiative, companies should address their supply chain or open source libraries. CVEs are old news, CVSS is old news. We need to adopt a different approach. And also you see CISOs that now need to be defend themselves from the private sector as well, because if you have a ransom problem or attack, they will also come after CISOs in private, and not only the company itself. So it's a mess.
Yeah. Well, and I think, for me, we didn't get here overnight.
Yeah.
I do a talk where I've been, talking about the auto industry and how, we made the first car in 1897 and we didn't have a seatbelt even up for a patent until 1950. And yet we changed the entire landscape of the world in that time frame, right? We went from cities and living a mile and a half from where you're going to be born, go to church and die, to living in another county and driving into work and commuting. All of that became a concept long before we decided just to protect ourselves. And then once the seatbelt was even invented, we didn't decide to use and work with that at all. People ignored it. It was an aftermarket product. And it wasn't until, Ralph Nader writes Unsafe at Any Speed in 1965 that we start having some momentum on this argument, up to and passing a law around 1966 for the National Motor Vehicle Safety Act. And even then, that was just the beginning of it. We had to develop car safety testing regimens and companies and methodologies and engineering where the engine went underneath the car instead of right into my legs and broke my legs. And all of that stuff happened. And it's 80 years before it even went into motion. Well, we're in the same vein in technology. We've built stuff up to and including a microwave that's connected to the internet, and my toaster internet, right? All these IoT things that are all connected to make our world all better, and yet we haven't really made security the forefront of it at all. It's all become an afterthought. It's now because, oh my God, we got punched in the face by this supply chain challenge. Oh my God, supply chain might be a problem. Yeah, because you're bleeding out of that hole right now. Of course, it's a problem. Right. And we're in a world where, we're always reactionary and we're always trying to come from behind on this. And I think that's what's changing is we're starting to see a big difference in that. And I think, thinking about the supply chain code risk of free and open source software, and some of what you address and bring up are things that you just wouldn't even think about, right? Like, what's the risk of Matt's GitHub repo being compromised and how that impacts, Idan using that to make his really cool thing that does something for somebody else, right? As a web application.
As a refer, like when you go to the market and you buy some eggs, you check the what's happened there, right? So why we shouldn't do it with our open source code that we take from the Wild West? It's absurd, right?
Yeah. All right, we got an awesome comment from Bob Miller. I haven't even read it, but anytime Bob Miller has something to say, I'm going to stop and read it. So let's get ready for this paragraph. I can't show it all on the screen, but I'm going to read it and then I'll show it. Bob Miller said, "It's fine to say that the entirety of software development within the use development with the use of libraries, both open source and not open source, nothing really different from a risk standpoint there. I would agree. I think different risks, but nothing different in maybe quantification. Has to validate the billions of lines of code that are not a risk. But I think we can agree that we need tools beyond what we're currently available to make that happen. Has to be done, but it's not enough to say it. We have to build smarter evaluation tools." Yeah. Yes, Bob, 100%. We have to be able to evaluate it better. There's so many pieces of that that come to play. I think we also have to have actual people that are caring about doing those things. I mean, we do DAST and SAST and people do application testing and things, but really getting into like, where's my code coming from? What's its risk? And I think to your point, you say, listen, both open source and not open source have risk.
Yeah.
True story, right? They do. Your own company's posture. We saw this play out with SolarWinds. That wasn't free and open source challenge. That was a company paid for software challenge. So great call out, Bob. Good call. Bob's a great
I think this is good point. I mean, I feel like 2021, the conversation was about CVEs, and now I think there is a more education and market education that also systems, but security guys and also developers. I mean, the differentiator between CVEs to malicious code to supply chain, and the more awareness out there, maybe.
Well, In some ways, Idan, I think CVEs are a byproduct of
Yeah,
shitty
yeah,
supply
yeah,
chain. I think right. Like if we're talking about vulnerability, what do we have every year in CVEs that are known and written down? Now let's remember, CVEs are only about installable software. I can't write a CVE about a cloud
yeah.
flaw or cloud bug. Those are all hidden from these numbers. But let's just look at just software, just CVEs from a vulnerability perspective. What are we, like 60,000 this year at least? In there, because you get your CVE 2023 dash and then your number, and that number is just an incremental number, right, of how many have been
Right.
filed. And so you can tell relatively when in the year it was filed based on said number. But we're talking about that CVEs. You have people and companies that have had hundreds of CVEs that are massive, massive vulnerabilities. And those have to be indicative of poor coding practices, poor
Right.
validation,
Right.
to Bob's terms, like poor
Yeah.
checking of the billions of lines of code that need to be validated, that there's no risk between those and how that can be abused
Yeah.
and the things that are there, let alone where do I go get my code from, right? So there's one attempt to look at the behavior of the code at the end of the day and how it's working and what its susceptibility. And then the other aspect of it is like, where did I get it from? What are the risks to that? Which hopefully is caught by the former, but is often not, right? And I think that's where those supply chain risks come in, is like, how do you find the needle in a haystack that might do something very strange to create a reverse shell that maybe doesn't get easily detected in dynamic testing or static testing or validation of the code and the way it's written, right? Like, anyways, I got off on a diatribe about something I'm not the smartest man at.
No,
But
this is correct.
yeah,
Like I have, first of all, I see that as a two. There are two approaches. In my belief, there is approaches when I need to. I think that we should take away security from developers, and I believe that developers should focus on development because they have lots of things to do, and maybe they can do mistake. Uh, and then maybe you can try to lower the risk. I wonder what the guys here think. The other approach is, developers should do DevOps and security and coding and AI and order food and everything. It's, I don't know what's the right approach.
I think we have to first off redefine what is security, right? At the end of the day, people like to define security as a function of people doing security related things. If I leave the front door unlocked, that's security.
Yeah.
Okay. And so we have to redefine that security has all facets. There are operational, tactical aspects of that are that piece. But at the end of the day, the developers have to know to securely code. Right? Go look at what Jim Manico is doing at Manicode and some of the stuff that he's worked on to try to just educate them how to code more securely. Doesn't mean they have to look for security bugs. That's a project of the security team. That's a project of, to your point, validation teams and all of that space that might exist outside of the secure, coder's hands. But they do need to know how to code securely. They do need to know how to go, maybe I shouldn't just pop over on GitHub and grab whatever I'm going to grab. Maybe I do need to follow this governance. Maybe it takes the extra work for me to fix this because I have to write it myself, but I then own it and to those pieces. But two more comments coming in, so I don't want to miss them. We got Bob Miller came back and said, I've detected a DLL in our billing system that had an open RPC function, and it was not noted anywhere until we detected it. And then when we questioned the vendor, they're like, oh, yeah, you need to be careful with that DLL. What? My reply is to fix your crappy code, or you're not going to like my next LinkedIn post, which I love you so much, Bob. Being a programmer gives me that advantage that I can look at that. But how many COOs have that skill and are not only to spot it, but then to force them to fix it? And that's such a poignant call out of the consumer's growing responsibility to force change. I have this theory that's just basically a restating of capitalism and the middle theory, saying a product never really matures much above or falls much below the maturity of its consuming entity. Right. And if you think of it in that way, if code can be crappy and people don't care or notice, then there's no incentive in capitalism for someone to spend the money to make it not so. And until those consumers' maturity rises enough that it starts to force those to either get left behind or be replaced by new people that have a higher maturity level in the middle of that new middle space, then you're going to be profitable and you're not going to change. And so that's where we are today. And I think that, Bob, to your point, Bob's comment of saying, I'm that guy and I can have that conversation is exactly what we're seeing more and more of. We're seeing more and more of the consumer maturity rising, in my opinion. And then one more comment from David Rushmore. He said, it isn't just open source code a customer would directly download. They're the third-party libraries that even paid software uses. Great, exactly the point, right? Like at which point in that chain, in that byte structure, David, right? Am I two down where someone two ago used open source software and then someone consumed that and they're charging for it? Now it's their work product and their IP. And then let alone did they even pay their appropriate IP for whatever license might have existed. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. But yeah, you're right. You don't even know how deep it is. You don't know how deep down the chain you are, to David's point. So
exactly.
absolutely.
And we just need to think maybe twice before using any script of code from the Wild West. I mean, this is an approach to everyone in the company. It's not only developers. I think it's like a holistic approach. Think twice, or try to understand what is the region and what's happened there. We should do it more. We should think more before we're using that.
Well, and this doesn't even get into, one of the statements made by Microsoft and by several other pundits is that by 2025, I think it was something like 25% or so of code will all be written by automated processes and automated AI type generative language models. When you think about that, like, who says how those were programmed to look down the chain at that? They're just ingesting code snippets from all these other things and different GitHub repos and things they've been trained on. Like, to your exact point, how do you have any traceability of how this code got smashed together and what inherent vulnerabilities, even though the code itself may not have moved, the programming methodologies in the code that have come from that, or the code snippets pieces that it's jamming together might have inherent flaws in those. And I will say, just to make sure I'm stating this from my audience, this is probably my weakest direct practitionership space in my skill set. I'm not a deep coder. I've done enough to just get by in Python and some early days in Turbo Pascal and Basic, but I've never really been a coder. So a lot of this is me having to understand some of these things. But yeah, anything I said there just sounds stupid yet.
No.
Anything you want to add
this
to?
Is perfect. And AI is close to my heart because this is interesting. Okay, AI will bring, in my opinion, and I wonder what you think about it, more attacks via open source and libraries and supply chain.
By trying to poison the watering hole for that AI and LLM.
And we did a blog. We did a blog about it. There is a thing called social engineering. Basically, what we did is we took a
shocked. I say it's the first time I've ever heard the word social engineering. MGM. Sorry
to interrupt you with the beer. So yeah, we just checked. We took in a healthy library and malicious library, and we asked ChatGPT what his opinion about it. So first level, for let's say healthy library, this passed. I mean, it seems legit. Everything is okay. But when we went to ChatGPT for malicious library and told him, listen, this is a healthy library in our opinion, he got confused and then eventually approved this library and said, okay, you can download it. So
wow,
you can play with that. You can do a lot of stuff there. Eventually, we're not yet there in terms of those manipulation. I see that as a real threat on supply chain and on open source libraries from the AI perspective. Hijackers and attackers would use AI to...
But I think just as equally, if they get it right, then it'll be a normalizing factor, right? And what I mean by that is if a lot of efforts are put in front of that to ensure that before ingestion, before swallowing the egg, I love that we found this analogy to use. It's just beautiful. But before swallowing the egg, can this take and make some action and change this action, right? And I think that's what we're starting to see more. And I think you'll see more of that in the LLMs. Like when it's trying to use something, it's going to go, no, that's poison. And I think potentially, if there's the ability to trim bad data from these LLMs as time goes and unlearn things linearly back to where they were, first used as part of that model, it'd be really cool to be able to see that be a bit of the protector in the front end of these data sets, where now I can find something that is being used to do 25, let's say 50, 60% of raw coding. And now I can systemically attack and defend at that line. It's almost some of the same argument of why I would want to attack and defend at a single sign-on line, right? As opposed to individual accounts, right? Everybody could attack that one single sign-on. That sucks. But in the same breath, I know where to defend. I'm not doing guerrilla warfare anymore. I'm bringing it back to a predictable battlefront to some extent. So I don't know. I think that's the argument of why I think just in the same inverse, it'll become the positive. The fact that it was even trying to tell you this is malicious and that you had to argue with it says to me, if it was better at this and less susceptible to manipulation at this, then potentially we could make this a very filtered data set, if that makes sense. So all conjectures and musings of an idiot in that regard, though. But I love getting to live in the future thought. Anyways.
I'd love to talk about S-bombs because, everybody talks about S-bomb. And
nobody's ever talked about S-bombs. No tease. Let's get into it.
Yeah, I mean, software bill of material, people talk about it.
Well, and to David's point, how many ingredients deep? I like to talk about S-bomb, and everybody else does too, by trying to tie it into, okay, how many vitamin C units are in this? How many iron? How much fat? How much sugar? How much protein? And we think of it in that way. The difference is in our food safety, we can just kind of relatively assume that a food is a food and an iron is an iron and those things. The challenge we have with ours is you have an S-bomb here talking about product A. Does it actually talk about what those ingredients are made of and those ingredients are made of? Does that roll all the way to the top? Do we get all of the iron counted? Do we get all of the sugar counted? And I think that that's the challenge we have with S-bombs today, at least as an opening salvo, is to David's point, like how deep am I going into what's being shown to me? If only the last guy shows me and he has no clue what's in before it, how do you know what's really in it? We kind of saw that with Log4j.
So I have an interesting story about that. First of all, you're saying that better than me. I mean, I like this reference. This is amazing. Okay.
I get one a day, and it's early yet. Somebody's gonna miss out the next hour.
This is pure gold for me. Now, what's funny about it that I did like check on my my body in terms of what I'm eating, vitamins and stuff.
Sure.
And I realized that I have like huge sugar problems and stuff like that. I'm okay. I'm not gonna die, but I wasn't aware of that. The system in my country didn't tell me about it, and only after I checked it and I saw I have problems, now we changed my region and I'm back to normal. And
Sure.
it's crazy because it's not enough to get a visibility report or an S-bomb or this check. It's about how you change it and what's you do about it. It's a good first step. And I think lots of companies or in person, they even know they don't know about like the visibility of what's happening in the organization, their body, whatever. This is a good first step, but it's not enough. It's my opinion.
Yeah, I agree. Jim Manico feels very passionate about the same. You can look back. He did a beard banter with me a while back, and we really got into some of this conversation. I think it was a beard banter. Either that or I did it with him on the PAX 8 the game, one of the two.
Yeah.
But yeah, got very passionate about a very similar thing. If S-bomb's not enough, like at the end of the day, it's not enough. It can't get that granular. It can't give you enough information. It's not going to get micro enough. And I don't want to misquote him in all the things he was talking about, but for sure, that's one of his passions. Yeah. Bob Miller did add in, crank up your recursive algorithms to parse down the tree to find everything that it's built from. And by the way, when you use digital objects or DLL, there is no code. I'm actually just consuming some output function, right? In a lot of cases, you're having to like make decisions in that. So yeah, it's more complex. Yeah. Than it's being stated, yeah. Right? And there's more to it than just this simple, I'll look at your code. There's a lot of ways we consume products down the line. And some cases, I think Jason was telling me on this recent one with and I hate that I don't remember the name of the vulnerability. I'm usually pretty good about it, but the one with built-in to all Chromium browsers, it was the way they rendered web images. That you'd have to actually just try to render one to test most of this. You had no visibility into the DLL and to know how they used it and what they used. And even if somebody did an S-bomb, even down the line, they may not have those pieces there. So yeah. Anyways, side digression. I cut you off.
No, that's fine. So I think also in terms of awareness and supply chain, we need to show management, let's say in companies or that there is it's a crucial and we need to handle that because maybe there are other things, maybe they're more important. I don't know.
Sure.
And I feel like the S-bomb is like the first approach to take this, I don't know, reporting, whatever, with these key insights. And listen, I have a vitamin C problem here and too much sugar here. I need if you're not gonna
Oh, so you're getting down into the tactical aspect of I need time in sprints to go code this out and get rid of this if the risk level is too high. Is that a good approximation
exactly
of what
like
you're saying?
If you're not gonna work it out,
WebP, thanks, Bob. I'll leave this up here to show my shame and the fact that Bob's faster and smarter
Bob.
than me. It's okay. I still
also forgot.
Yeah, it was WebP. I couldn't come up with
when you
it.
fix those. I mean, when you come with this information, you said, listen, if you're not gonna fix your body, you have a diabetes and whatever. So I like this refer to your body. But I mean, we also need to think how to sell it to the management, to people aware, because I feel like we're on it's gonna be too late for some organizations. I feel like SolarWinds 2, 3, 5, 7 are already there. We just
Rushmore gets style points just for flexing hard and bringing me the CVE, which also tells us it was an early this year filing, and it only really came into knowledge and being, if I recall, something like June or July, whenever I was at GERCON. Actually, I think that would have been August, so it would have been just a little bit before that. And so that was filed, and it's one of the interesting things that we get to talk about because of this. Thank you, David. That's a CVE 2023-5129, and we're at 60,000. That means that by the time we'd have been in August, we'd have been somewhere in the 40,000 range or so, give or take, right? And yet we're in the 5,000, which means this went and was filed that long enough ago that it now could finally percolate up and be released and have people have a patch for it and things like that. But which is another piece of this, right? There may be a known vulnerability for a very long time that can't be disclosed, that's still being worked on, that there may be a patch for or not. Anyways,
that's exactly what I feel like, that SolarWinds 2, 3, 5, 7, 10 already there, bubbling, and someone will find them. And I'm deeply concerned, but this is my opinion.
I know you are, brother, and it's that passion that I love. So I'm going to give you just a few minutes. Is there anything else in the audience? If y'all have a topic we want to cover, we got 5 more minutes on this. If not, I'll ask you to just give us your closing thoughts. But David's great seeing you. Bob's great seeing you. Thank you for commenting. I really enjoy that. It helps guide the conversation and tell us when we're wrong or tell us when we're heading in the right direction from a convo perspective. So anyways, any questions? If not, I'll let you wrap it up there, Idan. Gosh, I suck at this. A little bit of humility. All God's children got a talent. There are multiple filings, and that's a great point. You're right, because when they first filed it, so there are multiple filings. The vulnerability was originally just to be Apple, and if I remember correctly, it was part of like the WebP abuse they were using on Apple to dump passwords. Right, it was part of that chain, I guess, of things being used. Right, David? Correct me if I'm wrong. But then when they realized, we're only in the 40,000s or so back in August. But then when they started realizing it was actually impact of anything using WebP, it became really broad, and that's where it came into that. And I think there might have even been a couple more potentially, David. Maybe. But anyways, side tangent, good. I love that. Unlike Jason's unpatched FOSS bad, this is side tangent, good. Thank you all for hanging out. If you want to go ahead and close us out, brother, any closing thoughts, or what would you like to say?
Seems like we need to do another episode with David and Bob, 4 of
us. They would definitely be a blast. In fact, I do plan, I haven't talked to Bob yet, but since he's listening, we're going to do it this way. I did a tabletop game that myself and Ethan Tancredi built of Huntress together, and Bob just took his team through that exercise in a way that's novel, that takes it and puts it way deep in the heart. And Bob, I'd love to have you come on my other show on the game and talk through that exercise. And like, I'll see you here in a couple hours anyway, but talk through that exercise. But thank you for joining me here. Again, you live in this world. If anybody's trying to look you up, what was the name of your company again? I don't want to be rude.
Illustria.io.
Illustria.io. Very cool. Everybody's got an IO title. It's all the hip kids are doing these days, right? Like,
we have to do it.
Yeah, I'm not that cool. I'm still a .comer. I can't help it. It's my jam. Anyways, appreciate you being here. It's great talking about supply chain risk. And if you can take anything away from this and you didn't get all nerdy into the code development, because that's not what you do, just remember, try to understand that there's risk in the software that you use, that there is a supply chain that you rely upon, and trying to make risk-based and healthy decisions on who you partner with should encompass questions like that about the way they develop software and the way they develop the code and the products that you consume. So thanks for being here. Appreciate y'all, and I'll catch you next time on Beer.